Few Fire Emblem stories have been as scrutinized as Fire Emblem Awakening's. Its plot, characters, villains, and structure have all been torn a new one by many fans. However, an element of its storytelling, one only usually criticized or analyzed in passing, is Awakening's perplexing use of player choices at many key points in the plot. Emran's death, Lucina's judgment on Robin, the final strike on Grima. With the exception of the last example, no matter what option you choose, your decisions have no effect on the plot whatsoever. This left many players, including myself, quite confused and asking the question, why did it ask me to make a decision if it was just going to ignore it? Today we set out to answer that question and figure out just what the developers were trying to achieve with the inclusion of these player choice mechanics. Let's get started. The first and most practical explanation is that these player choices are simply remnants from a larger, more ambitious system. In an Awada-ass interview, Awakening's game director, Toru Naruhiro, directly mentions how they want to put as much as possible into Awakening, and that they just kept adding more and more as they want to include as many mechanics from the series' history as possible. Fire Emblem has had its fair share of choice systems before, such as in the Sacred Stones, so it is a very realistic possibility that earlier in development, these were supposed to be moments where the plot branched off into separate sections, but were unable to be put into the game due to time or monetary restrictions. Yet, I don't completely buy into this myself. It wouldn't have been that difficult to remove these choices once they realized they weren't going to be in the final product, yet they chose to keep them in. Why? One possibility is that they kept in these decision segments to give the illusion of choice on the first playthrough. I remember quite vividly during my first time playing the game that I thought the events that occurred after these choices happened because of what I chose. Since I didn't have a way to check at the time, I just assumed that things would have happened differently had I picked another option, and so the choices felt natural. However, this illusion of choice is quite dangerous once broken. As soon as the game asks for your input, there is somewhat of an unwritten contract that the game will listen and respect that choice. But when the game directly ignores or overrides said choice, it causes a lot of frustration on the player's end. The game handed you agency, then stripped it away when it didn't like what you chose. It creates a feeling of being cheated or tricked, which is why so many people take issue with these choices in Awakening. However, just because something creates frustration does not mean it is inherently bad. Like any other emotion in media, frustration can be created for a purpose, for a statement. So before we start accusing the developers of cheap tricks, let's explore this one level deeper. Let's give the developers the benefit of the doubt and say that they intentionally wanted the player to feel frustrated in these situations, and we'll see if it fits into Awakening's themes and overarching plot. This may seem like a stretch, but let's break down a specific moment and see if it fits this. The choice before Emran's death. Before Emran's death, the player has a decision to hand over the Fire Emblem to Gangrel to save Emran or let her die. No matter what the player chooses, Emran kills herself before anything of significance can happen, and the game proceeds as normal. No matter what the player chooses, they are totally helpless. They can't change the outcome even if they wanted to. If it was just left at this, I would take more issue with the choice's execution. Simply leaving the player helpless without comment or a connection to the themes is really reckless and not a recipe for success. But it doesn't leave it at that. At the end of the following chapter, when everyone is consoling Chrom on Emran's death, he makes a very interesting statement. Gods, I was just so powerless, so I didn't have to live with the guilt of either choice she chose for me. All of a sudden, this decision takes on a very different tone. To go back to the question I posed at the beginning of the video, why did the game ask me to make a decision if it was just going to ignore or override it? Well, when a game asks you to make a choice as hard as killing somebody, you think about it. You weigh the options morally, practically. You think about the situation as an agent. it puts you in that character's shoes. So when Chrom is expressing his frustration at his helplessness in the situation, the player can immediately relate. They just experienced exactly what Chrom did firsthand. But the problem of using this method, the method of ignoring the player's choice to increase empathy with Chrom, is that it simply creates more anger at the game than it does empathy with Chrom. In fact, I think most players would be very hard pressed to even remember that line from Chrom. It tries in a very subtle way to help the player relate to Chrom via a very unsubtle method, and unfortunately it ends up backfiring. I came into writing this video with a very negative opinion of Awakening's implementation of player choice, mainly from personal experience of finding said situations pointless and frustrating. Yet, upon closer inspection, I find myself much more conflicted. I can see what the writers and developers may have been trying to achieve here, a reinforcement of helplessness against the flow of time and the actions of others, yet it doesn't quite reach that. I think it is reasonable to say that they could have had the player empathize with Chrom without this player choice mechanic, but they want to go an extra step to bring that emotion home. It just didn't quite pan out. This doesn't only just apply to Emran's death. I think the same line of thinking can also be applied to Lucina's judgment on Robin. Player choice is something you have to be very precise with because of how many subconscious assumptions the player brings with them when presented with a decision by the game. However, that doesn't mean that ignoring the player is off limits. It's a potential opportunity to convey frustration, anger, helplessness, and potentially empathy. In the case of Awakening, I'm glad they tried this approach even if it didn't potentially pan out how they wanted to. It's game design decisions like this that really open up discussion about how common mechanisms and systems can be used in interesting and new ways to convey messages and themes. Thanks for watching.